I never thought my first day at university would turn into a complete disaster. Everyone around me was buzzing about one thing and one thing only: Dax Rivers, the campus's most infamous enigma. People were practically falling over themselves just to catch a glimpse of him, like he was some kind of celebrity instead of just another student. But me, I was just trying to find my classroom without making a scene, my hoodie pulled low over my face because my Omega scent felt unusually strong today. I'd taken my scent blockers this morning, double-checked the dosage, but paranoia still crept up my spine. What if someone noticed? What if they figured out what I was and decided I was easy prey? The thought alone made my stomach twist into knots. When I finally found the lecture hall and pushed through the heavy doors, the entire room went silent. Every head turned in my direction and I felt my cheeks burn under the attention. There was only one empty seat left, right in the middle of the room, and sitting next to that empty seat, Dax Rivers himself. He looked exactly like the rumors described. Sharp jawline that could cut glass, cold gray eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them, and an aura of dominance that practically radiated off him in waves, the kind of presence that made everyone else in the room seem small by comparison. I considered just standing in the back, but the professor had already noticed me and was gesturing impatiently toward the empty seat. My heart hammered against my ribs as I made my way down the aisle, hyper-aware of every eye following my movement. I slid into the seat as quietly as possible, keeping my gaze fixed straight ahead. Dax didn't even glance in my direction. He was completely absorbed in whatever he was writing in his notebook, his handwriting sharp and precise. For a moment, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. At least he wasn't going to make this weird. At least I could just sit here, take notes, and get through this class without any drama. That relief lasted exactly 15 minutes. Halfway through the professor's explanation of cellular biology, Dax suddenly turned his head toward me. His movement was so abrupt that I flinched, my pencil skittering across my notebook and leaving a jagged line across my notes. "You breathe really loudly," he said, his voice low enough that only I could hear but sharp enough to cut. "It's annoying." My mouth fell open in disbelief. Was he serious right now? I'd been sitting here minding my own business, and he had the audacity to complain about my breathing. I tried to calm the instant surge of anger that flooded through me, tried to remember that arguing with an enigma, especially one as powerful as Dax Rivers, was generally a terrible idea. My Omega instincts screamed at me to apologize, to submit, to make this go away. But I didn't. Instead, I turned to face him fully, meeting those cold gray eyes with as much confidence as I could muster. "And you're incredibly entitled. That's annoying too." For a split second, his eyes widened in what looked like genuine shock. His mouth opened slightly, as if he couldn't quite believe someone had just talked back to him. Maybe no one ever had before. Maybe everyone else at this university was too intimidated or too starstruck to tell Dax Rivers exactly what they thought of his attitude. While I wasn't everyone else, the rest of the class passed in tense silence. Dax didn't look at me again, didn't say another word, but I could feel the weight of his presence beside me like a physical thing. When the professor finally dismissed us, I gathered my things as quickly as possible, desperate to get out of there and put some distance between myself and the most arrogant person I'd ever met. But as I stepped out into the hallway, something prickled at the back of my neck. That feeling of being watched, of being followed. I turned around and there he was. Dax stood about 10 feet away, arms crossed over his chest, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth that made him look both dangerous and infuriatingly attractive. "Which pack do you belong to?" he asked, his tone casual but his eyes intense. "I'll make sure to contact them by tomorrow. You should know there are consequences for disrespecting me." My blood boiled. Who did this guy think he was? I adjusted the strap of my bag, then walked straight toward him, closing the distance until I was close enough to smell his expensive cologne, something dark and woodsy that made my Omega senses go haywire in a way I absolutely did not appreciate. "Go ahead and try," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the way my heart was racing. "I don't belong to any pack, and your threats don't scare me even a little bit." I turned on my heel and walked away, forcing myself not to look back, not to give him the satisfaction of seeing how much that encounter had shaken me, because the truth was, my hands were trembling slightly as I pushed through the exit doors. I'd just challenged an enigma, one of the most powerful dynamics in our society. I'd stood up to Dax Rivers on my very first day of university. That was either the biggest mistake I'd ever made or the bravest thing I'd ever done. Maybe both. As I walked across campus toward my tiny apartment off the edge of school grounds, I couldn't shake the image of his face from my mind. That moment of surprise when I talked back to him. The way his smirk had shifted into something more calculating, more interested, like I'd just become a puzzle he wanted to solve. I pushed the thought away and focused on the familiar path home, on the comfort of my own space where I could finally relax and let my guard down, where I wouldn't have to worry about arrogant enigmas or their ridiculous power plays. But even as I unlocked my apartment door and stepped inside, I couldn't quite convince myself that this was over. Something told me that my encounter with Dax Rivers was just the beginning of something much more complicated than I was ready for. Something that would change everything about my carefully planned, quietly anonymous university experience. I just didn't know how right I was. The next morning, I knew something was wrong the moment I stepped onto campus. People were staring at me, not just casual glances, but full-on stares accompanied by whispers behind hands and poorly concealed pointing. My stomach sank as I made my way toward my first class, trying to ignore the attention but feeling it like a weight pressing down on my shoulders. By lunchtime, I'd figured out what was going on. Dax had apparently told his extensive fan club about our encounter yesterday, framing it as some kind of insult that I dared to speak to him the way I had. Fantastic. Now I was officially a target, marked as the Omega who had the audacity to challenge the great Dax Rivers. But honestly, I'd been through worse. Much worse. I'd survived growing up in an underfunded orphanage where Omegas were treated like commodities. I'd clawed my way to a full scholarship at this prestigious university through sheer determination and academic excellence. One arrogant Enigma and his entitled followers? That was nothing. I could handle this. I stuck to my routine with stubborn determination. Classes, library study sessions, then back to my apartment. Simple, predictable, safe. I didn't engage with the whispers or the stares. I just kept my head down and focused on why I was here, to get an education and build a future for myself that didn't depend on anyone else. But Dax apparently had other plans. He was everywhere. At first, I thought it was coincidence. The cafeteria at lunch? Sure, he had to eat somewhere. The library during my usual study hours? Okay, maybe he actually studied sometimes. The hallway outside my biology classroom? That one was harder to explain away, but I tried. By the third day, though, it was impossible to deny. Dax Rivers was following me. Sometimes he'd make it obvious, standing where I could see him, his gray eyes tracking my every movement. Other times, I'd just catch glimpses of him at the edge of my vision, always watching, always present. It was creepy and unsettling, and I hated how hyper-aware it made me of everything I did. I found myself constantly checking over my shoulder, second-guessing my routes through campus, choosing less direct paths just to see if he'd follow. He always did. On Thursday afternoon, I was in the library trying to focus on my biology assignment when I felt him approach. I didn't look up, hoping that if I ignored him, he'd eventually get bored and leave. No such luck. "Do you think you're special?" His voice cut through the quiet atmosphere of the library, drawing annoyed looks from nearby students. I carefully closed my textbook, taking my time about it, using those few seconds to compose myself before I looked up at him. He stood over my table with his arms crossed, his expression hovering somewhere between curious and condescending. "I think you have way too much free time," I replied, keeping my voice cool and detached. "Don't you have anything better to do than harass scholarship students?" His jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath his skin. For a moment, I thought he might actually get angry, might drop that careful mask of superiority he always wore. Instead, something unexpected happened. He smiled. Not a friendly smile or even an amused one. This was something darker, more dangerous. The kind of smile that sent a shiver down my spine for reasons I didn't want to examine too closely. "I'm starting to like you," he said, his voice dropping lower, more intimate. "This defiance of yours, it's interesting." My stomach twisted uncomfortably. That wasn't a compliment. It was a warning, a declaration of intent. He wasn't going to leave me alone. If anything, my resistance was only making him more determined. I quickly gathered my things, shoving papers and textbooks into my bag with shaking hands. I needed to get out of here. Needed to put distance between us before this situation escalated into something I couldn't control. I stood up and walked away without another word, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. But I only made it about halfway to the library exit before panic set in for an entirely different reason. I could feel it, that familiar weakening of the suppressant barrier I maintained around my scent. I pressed a hand to my pocket where I usually kept my emergency blocker inhaler. Empty. I'd used the last dose this morning and forgotten to refill the prescription. My scent blockers were wearing off, and I was standing in the middle of campus surrounded by alphas and enigmas who would be able to smell exactly what I was within minutes. My breathing quickened as fear clawed at my chest. If anyone reported me for being on campus without proper suppressants, I could lose my scholarship. Everything I'd worked for, gone because of one stupid mistake. I fumbled through my bag desperately, hoping I'd somehow missed seeing the inhaler. But there was nothing. A shadow fell over me, and I looked up to find Dax standing there, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his body. His eyes had changed, the pupils were blown wide, almost completely black, and his nostrils flared as he breathed in. He knew. He could smell my scent starting to leak through the failing blockers. This scent? His voice was rough, strained in a way I'd never heard before. This is yours? I took a step backward, my spine hitting the wall behind me. Stay away from me. But he moved closer instead, eliminating the distance I'd tried to create. There was something almost predatory in the way he moved now, all his careful control slipping as his Enigma instincts responded to my uncovered Omega scent. Omegas aren't allowed on campus without proper suppressants, he said. But there was no triumph in his voice. No satisfaction at catching me in a vulnerable position. If anything, he sounded conflicted. I could report you right now. You know that, right? My heart plummeted. This was it. This was how everything fell apart. I'd worked so hard, sacrificed so much, and it was going to end because I forgot to refill a prescription. But then Dax did something completely unexpected. He shrugged off his expensive leather jacket and draped it over my shoulders in one smooth motion, completely enveloping me in the fabric and his scent. Put this on, he ordered, his voice firm. Now, and tomorrow you better have proper blockers or we're going to have a real problem. I stared at him in complete confusion, my mind struggling to process what was happening. Why would he help me? Why would he risk his reputation by covering for an Omega who couldn't even manage their own suppressants properly? It made no sense, went against everything I thought I knew about people like him. But I put on the jacket anyway because I didn't have a choice. The moment the fabric settled around me, his scent washed over my senses, cedarwood and rain and something earthy that I couldn't quite name. My Omega instincts immediately calmed, recognizing the scent as safe, as protective. It was a biological response I couldn't control, even as my rational mind screamed warnings. Why are you doing this? I managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. He looked at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he turned and walked away without answering, leaving me standing there wrapped in his jacket, more confused than I'd ever been in my entire life. Dax disappeared after that incident in the library. For 2 solid days, he was nowhere to be found on campus, and his absence felt strangely loud in a way I didn't want to acknowledge. People said he was sick. Some claimed he had important family business to attend to. I told myself I didn't care, that his whereabouts were none of my concern. But I kept his jacket. I told myself it was just because I needed to return it, that it would be rude not to give it back clean. I definitely wasn't keeping it because his scent somehow made me feel calmer. Safer. I absolutely wasn't burying my face in the collar when I got home at night, breathing in that cedar wood and rain smell until my racing thoughts finally settled enough to let me sleep. I had the jacket professionally cleaned and stored it carefully in my locker, checking my phone obsessively for any sign that Dax had returned to campus. When he finally showed up on the 3rd day, I was in the middle of opening my locker when I heard his voice behind me. Where's my jacket? I turned to find him standing there and immediately noticed something was off. His voice sounded hoarse, rougher than usual, and there were faint shadows under his eyes like he hadn't been sleeping well. He looked tired in a way that made him seem more human, less like the untouchable Enigma everyone worshipped. I pulled the jacket from my locker and held it out to him. It's clean, and thank you for what you did. He took the jacket, but as he reached for it, his fingers brushed against mine. The contact was brief, Barely a second, but it sent an electric shock up my arm that made me gasp. His eyes widened slightly, and I knew he'd felt it too. That strange, undeniable pull between us that neither of us could explain. He cleared his throat and changed the subject abruptly. "Do you live alone?" The question caught me completely off guard. "Why do you want to know?" "Just curious." His tone had softened somehow, lost some of that sharp edge of arrogance that usually defined how he spoke. I kept my guard up, unwilling to let him see how much his sudden interest affected me. "Yes, I live alone, and I prefer it that way." He nodded slowly, something thoughtful crossing his expression, then turned and walked away without another word. I stood there staring after him, trying to figure out what had just happened and why every interaction with Dax Rivers left me feeling more confused than the last. But over the next few days, I started noticing changes around campus. The whispers and stares that had followed me everywhere suddenly stopped. People who had been deliberately cruel or dismissive now avoided me entirely, giving me a wide berth in hallways and common areas. It was like someone had flipped a switch, transforming me from a target into someone untouchable. When I mentioned it to my friend Miller over coffee one afternoon, he gave me a knowing look that made my stomach drop. "Dax put out the word," Miller explained, stirring sugar into his drink. "Nobody touches you, like, literally nobody. You're under his protection now, whether you wanted it or not." Anger flared hot in my chest. I specifically told Dax I didn't need his help, didn't want his interference in my life. Who did he think he was, making decisions about my safety without even asking me first? I pulled out my phone and fired off a text before I could second-guess myself. "Stop interfering in my life." His response came back almost instantly, just one word that made my blood pressure spike. "No." That was it. I was done being passive about this. The next morning, I tracked Dax down in the cafeteria where he sat surrounded by his usual crowd of admirers and hangers-on. I marched straight up to his table, ignoring the shocked stares from everyone around us. "I don't need your protection," I said loudly enough for everyone to hear. He looked up at me with an expression of complete calm, like he'd been expecting this confrontation. "You don't have a choice in the matter. You're on this campus, which makes you my responsibility." "I'm not your anything." The words came out sharper than I intended, but I was too frustrated to care about the scene we were making. His eyes narrowed, but when he spoke, his voice remained controlled and measured. "You think I'm trying to own you? That's naive, Reed. I'm just trying to keep you safe." Hearing him say my name for the first time did something strange to my heart rhythm, made it skip and stutter in a way that had nothing to do with anger. How did he even know my name? Had he been asking about me, researching me? "Why?" I demanded, my frustration mixing with genuine confusion. "Why do you even care what happens to me?" For just a second, I saw something flicker across his face. Uncertainty, maybe even vulnerability. Then it was gone, replaced by that familiar mask of confidence and control. When he spoke, his voice had dropped lower, meant only for me despite our very public setting. "Because if something happened to you, I wouldn't be able to forgive myself." The confession hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't about power or territory or any of the usual Enigma dominance games. This was something else, something deeper and more personal that I didn't know how to process. Before I could formulate a response, he picked up his coffee, stood and walked away, leaving me standing there in the middle of the cafeteria with everyone staring. I felt frozen, his words echoing in my head on repeat. My heart was doing things it had no business doing, responding to Dax Rivers in ways I'd sworn I wouldn't allow. This was getting complicated in ways I'd never anticipated when I first arrived at this university. Miller found me later, concern written all over his face. "You okay, man? That was pretty intense." "I don't know what's happening," I admitted, running my hands through my hair in frustration. "Why would he care about protecting me? We barely know each other. We don't even like each other." "Are you sure about that last part?" Miller asked quietly, and I didn't have an answer. That night, I lay awake in my apartment, staring at the ceiling and trying to make sense of everything. Dax Rivers was arrogant and controlling and everything I should stay away from. But he'd also protected me when I was vulnerable, helped me when he could have destroyed my future with a single report. He said things that suggested he cared about my well-being, that I mattered to him for reasons I couldn't understand. And the worst part? Some treacherous part of me was starting to care back, starting to wonder what it would be like to let someone like Dax into my carefully guarded life, starting to imagine what those gray eyes might look like if they ever softened with genuine affection instead of cold calculation. I was in trouble, deep, complicated, dangerous trouble, and I had no idea how to get myself out of it, or if I even wanted to anymore. The following week brought the annual Enigma Alpha Mixer, one of those exclusive campus events that normally wouldn't even register on my radar. Omegas weren't typically on the guest list, which suited me just fine, but Miller had other ideas about my social life. "You need to get out more," he insisted, blocking my path to the library with his considerable alpha bulk. "You're always alone, Reed. One night won't kill you." I wanted to argue, to explain that I preferred solitude to the awkward social dynamics of watching Enigmas and Alphas peacock around each other. But Miller had that determined look in his eyes, the one that meant he wouldn't drop this until I agreed. So I reluctantly gave in, already planning my exit strategy before we even arrived. The venue was decorated with an elegance that screamed money and privilege. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over clusters of students dressed in designer suits that probably cost more than my entire semester's worth of textbooks. I immediately felt out of place in my simple black shirt and worn jeans, like a stray cat that had wandered into a dog show. Miller abandoned me almost immediately, drawn away by a group of alpha friends near the bar. I retreated to a corner, nursing a glass of punch and counting down the minutes until I could reasonably leave without Miller guilt-tripping me about it later. Then the crowd shifted, creating a natural pathway toward the small stage at the front of the room. Dax appeared, moving through the parted sea of admirers like he owned not just the room but the entire building. Everyone erupted into applause before he'd even said a word, their adoration so thick in the air it was almost suffocating. He took the microphone with practiced ease, launching into a speech about leadership and excellence and the responsibilities that came with power. His voice carried that natural authority that made people lean forward, hang on every word like he was revealing the secrets of the universe, instead of delivering what was essentially a glorified pep talk. But then his eyes found mine across the crowded room. Everything else faded into background noise. The applause, the conversations, the music playing softly through hidden speakers, all of it became distant and unimportant. For several heartbeats, the entire world narrowed down to just the two of us, locked in a moment of connection that I felt all the way down to my bones. I watched his rhythm falter just for a second. He lost his place in whatever he'd been saying, had to glance down at his note cards to recover his train of thought. Nobody else seemed to notice, too caught up in their worship to see the crack in his perfect facade. But I saw it. I saw how I affected him, how my presence threw off his carefully maintained control. When his speech finally ended to thunderous applause, I decided it was time to make my escape. I'd fulfilled my obligation to Miller, shown my face at this ridiculous event. Now I could go home to my quiet apartment and try to process whatever had just happened between Dax and me during that loaded eye contact. I was almost to the exit when someone stepped directly into my path. Trent Blackwood, another campus celebrity known for his aggressive pursuit of whatever caught his interest. The smell of alcohol wafted off him in waves, and his eyes had that glazed look of someone who'd had several drinks too many. "You're the one everyone's talking about," he said, his words slightly slurred. "Dax's rumored Omega." I took a careful step backward, trying to maintain distance. "That's just gossip. It's not true." "Really?" His grin turned predatory, and before I could react, his hand shot out and grabbed my wrist. His grip was too tight, painful enough to make me wince. "Then I guess that means you're available." My Omega instincts kicked into overdrive, flooding my system with panic. "Let go of me, right now." But Trent didn't release me. Instead, he pulled me closer, invading my personal space with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no and meant it. "Why so hostile? I'm just trying to be friendly here." Then suddenly, Trent's hand was ripped away from my wrist. Dax stood between us, his entire body radiating a fury so intense it was almost visible. His eyes had gone completely black, his Enigma aura expanding outward in a wave of dominance that made several nearby people stumble backward. "You touched him." Dax's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried more threat than any shout could have. "You actually put your hands on him." Trent's alcohol-induced bravado evaporated in the face of Dax's rage. "Hey man, I didn't know he was yours. I was just..." "Leave," The single word carried the weight of an absolute command, the kind of alpha order that bypassed conscious thought and went straight to primal instinct. If I ever see you near him again, if you so much as look in his direction, I will make sure you regret ever setting foot on this campus. Trent practically ran for the exit, stumbling over his own feet in his haste to escape. The crowd around us had gone silent, everyone staring at the scene we'd just created. But Dax didn't seem to notice or care about the audience. His attention was entirely focused on me. He reached for my wrist, the same one Trent had grabbed, his touch infinitely gentler as he examined it for bruises. Then he laced his fingers through mine and guided me out of the main hall, through a side door that led to a private balcony overlooking the city lights. The cool night air hit my overheated skin, helping to clear some of the adrenaline fog from my brain. Dax stood close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his body, could hear the barely controlled rage still making his breathing uneven. "Are you hurt?" His earlier fury had transformed into something softer, laced with genuine concern that made my chest tighten. I shook my head, though my hand was definitely trembling now that the immediate danger had passed. Dax noticed, and without asking permission, he took both of my hands in his, steadying them with his warmth and solid presence. "This is exactly what I've been trying to prevent," he said, his voice low and intense. "Do you understand now? This is why I can't just leave you alone, why I need to make sure you're protected." "I'm not your responsibility," I protested. But even to my own ears, the argument sounded weak and unconvincing. "Yes, you are." He stared directly into my eyes with an intensity that stole my breath. "You might not understand it yet, but you are." "What does that even mean?" I was so tired of cryptic statements and half-explanations. He released my hands and took a step back, and I immediately missed his touch. "Nothing. Forget I said anything." But I couldn't forget. That night, lying in my narrow bed and staring at my apartment ceiling, I replayed every moment on that balcony. The protective fury in his eyes, the gentleness of his touch, the way he'd looked at me like I was something precious that needed guarding. And for the first time, I let myself wonder if maybe Dax wasn't the villain in my story. Maybe he was something else entirely, something I was too scared to name. Morning came with news that spread through campus like wildfire. Trent had been suspended, effective immediately. The official story involved evidence of harassment and violation of the student code of conduct. All of it apparently documented and submitted by Dax himself. I should have been angry about the interference, about Dax taking matters into his own hands without consulting me. Part of me was angry, but a larger part felt something else entirely. Relief, safety, and a gratitude I wasn't quite ready to acknowledge. I found Dax outside the chemistry building during the break between classes. Without giving myself time to second-guess, I grabbed his arm and pulled him into an empty classroom, shutting the door firmly behind us. "You got Trent suspended," I said, not bothering to frame it as a question. He leaned casually against one of the desks, completely unbothered by my accusatory tone. "Yes. Is that a problem? You can't just control every aspect of my life." The words burst out of me, fueled by days of confusion and frustration. "Actually, I can, and I will." His expression shifted to something more serious, more determined. "You think this is about control or some power trip. But the reality is much simpler. If I don't protect you, you won't be safe. This campus has plenty of people who would target a vulnerable Omega." "Then tell me why." I was practically shouting now, all my carefully maintained composure crumbling. "Why do you care so much about what happens to me?" He went very still, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides like he was physically fighting with himself. The silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken truths. When he finally spoke, his voice was raw and stripped of all its usual arrogance. "Because you're my fated mate, Reed." The world stopped spinning, my brain completely short-circuited, unable to process what he'd just said. Fated mates were supposed to be rare, almost mythical. They were the stuff of romance novels and wishful thinking, not real life. Not my life. "That's not possible," I whispered, backing up until my spine hit the wall. "It is possible, it's reality." He took a step toward me, then seemed to think better of it and stopped. "The night in the library, when your scent broke through your blockers, I knew instantly. Enigmas recognize their destined mates on a biological level. Everything in me knows that you belong with me." My heart was racing so fast I felt dizzy. "But I don't want." "I know." He cut me off, but not cruelly. His voice was gentle, understanding in a way I never would have expected from him. You don't want me, you probably hate me, and I'm not going to force you into anything. That's not what this is about, but I can't change the truth, Reed. That's why I keep trying to stay away from you, trying to give you space. But every time you're in danger, every time someone threatens you, my Enigma side loses control. I couldn't speak. My throat had closed up completely, overwhelmed by the storm of emotions raging inside me. Fear and confusion dominated, but underneath those was something else. Something I absolutely refused to examine too closely. Without another word, I fled. I ran from that classroom, from the building, from Dax and his impossible confession. I didn't stop until I reached Miller's apartment, pounding on his door until he answered. Reed, what's wrong? Miller pulled me inside, concern written all over his face. Everything spilled out of me in a chaotic rush. Dax's confession, the fated mate revelation, my complete inability to process any of it. To his credit, Miller listened to the entire story without interrupting, without judgment. So fated mates are actually real, he said when I finally ran out of words. I always thought that was just stories. Apparently not. I slumped onto his couch, emotionally exhausted. What am I supposed to do, Miller? I don't even know Dax. He's arrogant and controlling and everything I should avoid. But he's also protected you every single time you needed it, Miller pointed out quietly. He hasn't hurt you, Reed. In fact, he's done the opposite. He's kept you safe even when you told him not to. He sat down beside me, his hand warm on my shoulder. Listen to what your heart is telling you, not just your head. That night, alone in my apartment, I stared at my phone for a solid hour before finally typing out a message to Dax. I need time to think about everything. His response came within seconds, like he'd been waiting for me to reach out. Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere. Whenever you're ready, I'll be here. I set my phone aside and stared at my ceiling, trying to untangle the mess of feelings inside me. Was what I felt toward Dax just Omega biology responding to an enigma? Or was there something real underneath all the confusion and fear? And more importantly, was I brave enough to find out? 2 weeks passed in a strange sort of limbo. Dax kept his promise, giving me the space I'd asked for. I saw him around campus, in classes, at the library, in the cafeteria, but he never approached me. He maintained his distance, though I could feel his eyes on me constantly, always watching to make sure I was safe. And somewhere during those 2 weeks, something shifted inside me. I started noticing Dax's absence more than his presence. I missed the way he'd materialize whenever I needed help, missed the security of knowing he was looking out for me. Even his annoying habit of showing up everywhere I went had become something I'd grown accustomed to, something I actually wanted back. The realization that I was falling for him crept up slowly, then hit me all at once like a freight train. I was in love with Dax Rivers, the arrogant campus enigma I'd sworn to hate. Late one evening, I was walking home through the quieter streets near campus when I heard the screech of tires. A car came barreling through the intersection, completely ignoring the red light, heading straight for me. I froze, my body locked in fear. Then someone slammed into me from the side, tackling me out of the car's path. We hit the pavement hard, rolling several times before coming to a stop. I was completely covered by a larger body, protected from the impact. Dax, are you okay? His voice was frantic, his hands running over me checking for injuries. Reed, answer me. Are you hurt? I'm fine, I managed to say, though my entire body was shaking. What about you? That's when I noticed the blood. His arm was scraped raw from where it had hit the pavement, and there was a cut on his face that was bleeding steadily. He'd taken the brunt of our fall, had positioned his body to shield mine from harm. We need to get you to a hospital, I said, trying to stand up. I'm fine. You're safe, that's all that matters. But his arm was clearly injured, and the cut on his face needed attention. I grabbed his uninjured arm with more force than necessary. Hospital or my apartment? Choose one, because you're not walking away from this. He looked surprised by my forcefulness. Then something like amusement flickered across his face. Your apartment. I lived close enough to walk, supporting most of Dax's weight as we made our way to my building. My apartment was small and modest. Nothing like what I imagined Dax was used to. But he didn't comment on the worn furniture or the tiny kitchen. He simply sat where I directed him on my couch, watching me with those intense gray eyes as I retrieved my first aid kit. Cleaning his wounds required me to sit close, close enough to feel his breath on my skin, to see the flecks of darker gray in his eyes. He stayed perfectly still the entire time, not even flinching when I applied antiseptic to his scraped arm. "Thank you," he said softly as I wrapped a bandage around the worst of the scrapes. "Don't thank me. You got hurt because of me." My voice came out rougher than I intended, thick with emotions I couldn't quite name. "No." He caught my hand, stopping my movements. "I got hurt because I chose to protect you. And I'd make that same choice again and again, as many times as necessary. Your safety means everything to me." My throat went tight with unshed tears. I looked into his eyes and saw past all the arrogance and control I'd used as armor against him. I saw vulnerability and pain and genuine care. This wasn't the untouchable campus Enigma. This was just Dax, a person who had somehow fallen for me as completely as I'd fallen for him. "Why?" I whispered. "Why would you do all this for me?" He took my hand in both of his, cradling it gently. "Because you're the most important person in my life, Reed. Fated mate or not, that wouldn't change how I feel. I've been in love with you since the first day, when you looked me in the eye and called me entitled. You were the first person who ever saw past my reputation, who treated me like a regular person instead of some untouchable enigma." Tears spilled down my cheeks before I could stop them. I'd never imagined I could love an enigma, especially not someone as seemingly arrogant as Dax. But when he held my hand like it was something precious, when he laid his heart bare before me, my own heart had no choice but to respond. "I love you too," I said, the words feeling both terrifying and right. "I love you, Dax." He pulled me into his arms, holding me tight against his chest like he was afraid I might disappear. I could hear his heartbeat, strong and steady, and feel the careful way he held me, protective but never possessive. In that moment, I understood. It didn't matter what the rest of the world thought about us. It didn't matter that we'd started as enemies or that everyone expected me to worship him like they did. We'd chosen each other, not because of fate or biology, but because of what we'd built together through every confrontation and moment of vulnerability. The next day, when I told Miller everything that had happened, he just laughed and shook his head. "Finally," he said with a grin, "I was getting tired of watching you two dance around each other." I smiled back, feeling lighter than I had in weeks. Because for the first time in my life, I was genuinely happy. I had Dax, my impossible enigma who'd somehow become my whole world. And he had me, his fated mate who'd chosen to love him not because destiny demanded it, but because my heart had decided he was worth the risk.